Dr. Tony Janicki. He's the president of Janicki Environmental, and he's worked for more than 20 years dealing with water quality and quantity concerns in Florida. Much of his work had been for local governments, water management districts, and national estuary programs. His most recognized efforts have been for the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium, and recently in developing NNC for Southwest Florida estuaries and in the examination of water quality problems in the Indian River Lagoon. He also has been instrumental in minimum flow levels developed for 4 of the state's water management districts. This work has included examination of minimum flow levels for the Silver, Ichetucknee, Sewanee, and Peace Rivers. And today he's going to be talking to us about the Tampa Bay Estuary Program, its history and status.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I'm a newbie, and it's very interesting to see a group like this. There's a lot of energy, and there's a lot of imagination and initiative that I see in this, and the importance that you see in developing strong science-based decisions. And that's very important, because one of the things that I've been a proponent of for a long, long time is let the data tell you what the story is. There's too many opinions out there that aren't based very much on data, aren't very much based on science. And that's what we're fighting up against so many times when we're dealing with environmental issues. I'm actually pinch hitting for Holly Greening, who's the executive director of the Estuary program. Holly and I, we've been working together for 30 years, and 20 some odd years on Tampa Bay in particular. Today, I'm going to use the word we many times, and when I say we, I'm talking about the Tampa Bay community. I'm not talking about my firm, I'm not talking about the Estuary program, but what you'll see as I go through this is the importance of a collaborative effort. There's other C words to use: compromise, cooperation. There's lots of those C words that are very, very important. So when I say we, I'm talking about the people that live and enjoy the Tampa Bay environment. So let me tell you a little bit about Tampa Bay. It's the largest open water estuary in Florida, about 400 square miles. The watershed is 6 times that area, which is important because that is indicative of the amount of fresh water and whatever pollutants that come along with that fresh water as it leaves the watershed and enters the estuary. It's relatively shallow. There's 2.3 million people approximately in the watershed. And what you don't see on here is that there is going up this stretch of Tampa Bay is a very significant shipping channel. And it supports both the Port of Tampa and Port Manatee. We were looking at Port Manatee earlier. That channel is really important because it has a major effect on how Tampa Bay responds to inputs of nutrients that are coming from the watershed. And it's a really interesting watershed. The red is urban, and here's St. Pete, and here's Tampa and Clearwater. And what makes it really interesting is that there's a lot of mining, phosphate mining that occurs in the watershed as well. And all this green and yellow sorts of things are typically agriculture. So it's not just urban. There's a lot of other things going on in the watershed that affect Tampa Bay. This is what it looked like back in the bad old days in the 1970s. Now if I go back a second, what I'm doing, I'm looking at this picture, I'm looking at Hillsborough Bay. Now Hillsborough Bay is interesting because the Hillsborough River and the Alafai River in particular, 2 of the 4 major freshwater inputs to Tampa Bay. It's also the smallest segment of the 4 segments that make up the major part of Tampa Bay. And it also was and still is the recipient of wastewater from the city of Tampa. But back in the 1970s, before there was any much going on, we had these buildups of macroalgae. There were all kinds of nasty things happening back in the 1970s. We lost about half our seagrass. We lost about half of our natural shoreline. A lot of the tidal marsh had been destroyed. White ibises plummeted. Light attenuation, visibility reduced significantly in Tampa Bay, and fish kills were common. To the point where maybe after the Cuyahoga River burning, Tampa Bay became the cause célèbre for environmental issues back in the 1970s and was part of a 60 Minutes presentation. So why did the Bay see this decline? Well, first thing, let's go back a second. Most of what we're talking about here are things that are anthropogenically responsible. And the population of Tampa Bay, as in most urban areas in Florida, really didn't see big increases until we had air conditioning coming around in the middle of the 1950s. So a lot of the problems that we see in Tampa Bay really started back then. And that's an important thing to consider because if it took that long for the less attractive things to happen in Tampa Bay, you can't expect necessarily an immediate turnaround. And so what were the problems? More people, more sewage. And not only was there more sewage, but it was poorly treated. Dredge and fill. If you look at Boca Ciega Bay, you look at other areas of Tampa Bay, there's a lot of dredge and fill. I live on a dredge and fill island in St. Pete. There was a lot of that kind of stuff that went along in the 1960s. Very, very, very little in terms of regulation at the time. And then, of course, I mean, back in that time, especially in the 1970s, no one talked about stormwater. EPA was most interested in dealing with things like point sources because they were pretty critical. The common, pollutant and problem that we had with respect to all these situations was nitrogen. So, what happened? Well, this is Bayshore Drive in Tampa. Here's downtown Tampa. And a good part of the population that lives along the shore are part of that 1%. Remember we talked about the 1%? And luckily, that was the case because they were able to get the regulators, to get the legislators to pass legislation. In 1978, it was Grizzle Fig. And what that did, it required all wastewater plants that discharged directly into Tampa Bay or Sarasota Bay to go to advanced wastewater treatment. Now, advanced wastewater treatment means rather than putting out 20 or some odd milligrams per liter of nitrogen, there's a maximum of 3 milligrams per liter that's required by that legislation. And where I live, St. Pete, we've gone to complete reuse. So there's no, well, with the exception of this past weekend, we saw a picture of Clam Bayou. Clam Bayou doesn't look like that today. St. Pete had some problems with keeping up with all the rainwater. But with those few exceptions, St. Pete is doing a pretty darn good job in terms of reducing the amount of wastewater that's going into Tampa Bay. The long and the short of it is that by the early 1980s, some of these wastewater plants had reduced their loads by as much as 90%. So what happened? Well, back in 1991, the Tampa Bay area, with support from Congress, nominated Tampa Bay to become part of the National Estuary Program. So Tampa Bay was, as Indian River Lagoon has been, and Sarasota Bay and Charlotte Harbor, recognized as an estuary of national significance. And what does that mean? It means that EPA was coming in to work with the local governments and the stakeholders to develop a plan that's referred to as a CCMP, or Comprehensive Conservation Management Plan, which was to address a number of issues, one of which was important, and that is water quality. The partners are what's really important. And when I talk about the we, this is kind of the we. Maybe EPA and DEP maybe don't want me to say that, but I work a lot, as I said, as Jamie said, with a lot of local governments. I work with each and every one of these agencies, actually. And with the estuary program in particular in the central part. So they provide a clearinghouse for information and knowledge and development of appropriate approaches to deal with some of the issues that affect the Tampa Bay estuary. this was an important one. This was, I think, one of the real critical things that in the early 1990s we decided on, and that was to identify a key indicator that was indicative of the degradation of what had happened in Tampa Bay, that might be indicative of the restoration of Tampa Bay, and that was seagrass. And not only it was an indicator because it also provided critical habitat for many biota, and people could see it. So when you put all those things together, seagrass ended up being a great indicator. And one of the things that we did, and that my guys and myself, and that we looked at a series of historical seagrass photos. And this is, they've done it in Indian River Lagoon. We did it in Sarasota Bay and Charlotte Harbor, and did it with some folks up in Chesapeake Bay. But one of the things that we did when we did this is we looked at a series of photographs taken in 1950. Now that was, again, before the big, that was post-World War II, but before a big increase in population. So there were some changes already, but recognizing that it was a defensible, and again, defensible data-driven decision to set that as the baseline. Now, what's really important is that this is the map of Tampa Bay. The red areas were the areas that lost seagrass between 1950 and 1990. And there's a lot, and it's all over the place, and that was really, really very important. So we established a restoration goal. Another important thing, I'll probably mention this several times. I remember working with assistant county administrator, a utilities director, someone at SwiftMud, and one of the things they kept saying to me was when we were working on this was, don't give me a plan that says improve water quality. You think about how many management plans that say, improve this or reduce that. The question they always gave me is, when is enough enough? We'll pony up what it takes to get things done, but don't tell me, don't give me this indeterminate goal. So setting a quantitative goal, again, was really important in moving forward with the restoration of Tampa Bay. So it's not that difficult in many respects. The seagrass, in trying to get seagrass back into Tampa Bay, we recognize that there were a number of things that affected or that resulted in a loss of seagrass. One of the things that when we did that map that I talked about is that where there may have been grasses in 1950, there might be a power plant sitting there right now, or some houses. Obviously we're not going to get those acres back, right? So, let's be realistic in what we could get back. And so we focused on this paradigm, this strategy, recognizing that increases in nitrogen loading. The science was there to support nitrogen as the limiting nutrient in Tampa Bay. Not too surprising. Remember talking about phosphate mining? A lot of the watershed is in the Bone Valley. We got a lot of phosphorus, but it's the nitrogen that tends to be limiting. That nutrient supply affects the chlorophyll, the algal populations in the bay, which in turn affect light attenuation. And light attenuation is to the point that it's so great that the seagrasses aren't getting the amount of light they need. They're not going to grow and reproduce. So we went backwards and we said, okay, we know how much seagrass we want to get back. How much light do they need? How much light are they getting? And can we look back quantitatively and develop quantitative relationships between chlorophyll and light attenuation and loads in chlorophyll? So we have a simple strategy to address this issue of the effects of nitrogen, excessive nitrogen going into Tampa Bay, affecting chlorophyll, affecting light, and affecting seagrasses. So that's what we did. Now, so we have, let me go back 1 second real quick, and I keep doing that, I'm sorry. We have a target load. We knew how much seagrass we wanted. We know what the seagrass light requirement was. And then we could estimate a target chlorophyll, and from that we can estimate a target load. The interesting thing is, I'll go back here now. The interesting thing is, having set that nitrogen load, the next important question was, are we there now? And more importantly, where are we going to be relative to that load in the future? So one of the things that we did was we estimated not only the loads for the more recent years, but we also looked into the future. And obviously, there are going to be changes in loadings that are associated with increases in population. A number of them, are associated with wastewater as well as stormwater. And we estimated that over a 5-year period, that we were expecting an increase of nitrogen loading to Tampa Bay of 85 tons per year. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about that? Well, we sat around the table, and one of the things that became very apparent was the local governments and those government agency stakeholders, they didn't have the wherewithal to reduce that probability of getting, or to address that 85 tons at the end of 5 years. So they decided to partner up, and they partnered up with a number of different private entities, private sector entities. Importantly, in that, and I'll talk about some of those, but in a very cooperative and voluntary manner, did this group of stakeholders address this issue. They weren't required by regulation, but they stepped up to the table and said, we'll work on this together to meet these goals. And that's the way it started, in a very voluntary fashion. It became more or less formulated into what we've called the Tampa Bay Nitrogen Management Consortium. And as I said, it's a partnership of local governments, regulatory agencies, the phosphate companies. Ag was really important. I think, and I may be wrong, but there aren't a whole lot of watershed planning things that have gone on in Florida that have brought ag into the process. And they were very active in doing that. And importantly, the electric utilities, because as you'll see in a little bit, one of the real important sources of nitrogen in Tampa Bay is coming from the atmosphere. And that's from the emission of nitrous oxides from the power plants that end up on the watershed and in Tampa Bay as a form of atmospheric deposition. 45 groups, again, when we began this Nitrogen Management Consortium, we were working together. We were all really happy. Things were going really well. We knew that the EPA had established a TMDL back in 1998, but like in many cases, people didn't pay much attention to the TMDLs. It wasn't until actually 10 years later, I remember my friend Daryl Joyner from DEP comes down to talk with us at the consortium and said, hey guys, you remember that TMDL? Well, EPA is requiring us to put caps on the loads going into Tampa Bay in all the permits, and the NPDES permits, stormwater and the wastewater discharges. So we weren't real happy. But what we did was, because there were some examples of BMAPs, if you know what a BMAP is, some of them have been some of them okay and some not so okay. So what the consortium decided was, why don't we approach DEP and EPA and say, let us do this. You're too busy anyways. Let us help you. And they agreed. And so as a result, we were able to drive the bus, which is really important because, well, number one, we were dealing with some people in some of the agencies that really didn't know Tampa Bay. They really didn't know Tampa Bay from Sarasota Bay in many respects. But more importantly, there was a commitment on the part of all the partners in the consortium to do this thing right. And by doing it right, remember we talked about data, good science, those sorts of things that really make it very difficult to disagree with what we have been doing. So the consortium, again, there were about 45 groups. I think it's actually more. Back at that time, the Estuary program has been maintaining an action plan database, and it's actually kind of evolved since then, recently. 500 projects in the Tampa Bay watershed to address nitrogen loading to Tampa Bay. That's incredible. And some of these are hard projects, some of them are softer projects, some of them have to do with public education, recently fertilizer ordinance and that sort of thing. But the real important thing was everybody ended up with they voluntarily agreed to a cap on their nitrogen loading to Tampa Bay. And I know cap and trading is not a real happy wording for some folks, but cap and trading had in its origin how the United States addressed acid rain issues years ago. And that's where cap and trading really came from. And we've been using that kind of a strategy in Tampa Bay in the last few years. So we have the legislation, we're talking about all this collaboration. What's happening in the Bay? Well, what's happening in the Bay is back in the battle days in the mid-1970s, we had upwards of 10,000 tons per year of nitrogen going into Tampa Bay. With the passage of that legislation, this is what happens when you start addressing the low-hanging fruit of wastewater plants. Because you've got the discharge. It's not like you're dealing with stormwater or atmospheric deposition. You got a pipe, and you can go back in that pipe and go and develop processes to reduce the loading that's going in. And in a second, I'll address the sources, but you can see that there was a large drop, but there's a continual drop. Even this is the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. The population was increasing significantly over that 20 or 30-year period, yet we saw a continual, more gradual decline in load, but it continued. Now, not only did the amount change, like I said, from about 10,000 tons to about 4,500 tons, but the specific sources of nitrogen changed significantly. Prior to the grizzle fig, point sources accounted for more than half of the nitrogen going into Tampa Bay. Non-point sources and atmospheric deposition, around 20% each. This material loss is a real interesting one. We talked about mining. Well, a lot of the phosphate fertilizer that leaves the Tampa Bay area goes through the port of Tampa. So we've got railroads coming in, bringing in fertilizer, and for years, they didn't do a very good housekeeping job. And so, they would be putting, the fertilizer on board these ships, and anything that happened to fall off into the bay, it did. Whatever was on the deck, they may hose it off. And you can imagine how much nitrogen was going in there. When they started looking at that, they realized that they were losing money. So they started doing some really important good housekeeping things. And so they reduced their loads, pretty significantly from about 5% of the total load to actually it's less than 1%. That's unique to Tampa Bay, but again, it's a way in which a private sector cooperator in the consortium addressed their issue. So we reduced the point sources. Only 12% of the total load now is due to point sources. The bandit right now is not non-point sources. Atmospheric deposition is about the same percentage, but in terms of the absolute amount, it's quite a bit less. And I talked about the electric utilities. TECO, and it was really a regulatory action that was taken. They've reduced their emissions incredibly, and their emission reductions can easily be monitored, as well as the monitor of the quality of the rainwater that's falling in the area. And addressing those things, resulted in them reducing their total load. So we're going from an issue that's associated with point sources to one that's now more driven by non-point sources. Now, where is the non-point source coming from? Well, about a little more than 40% comes from pasture rangelands and agriculture. So in that sector, that's a pretty big portion of the non-point source coming into the bay. Mining is about 9%. Residential is only 32%. Everyone's thinking that that's where it's all happening, but you remember all the green and yellow stuff in the watershed. There's a lot of ag going on, and dealing with runoff from agricultural lands is an important portion of what we need to be doing in the future. This is another way of looking at it. This is, when somebody calculated this, it was Ed Sherwood at the Estuary program. I was like, you better check those numbers. Okay, these are the per capita load estimates from those battle days of the 1970s, that in excess of 14 pounds per year per capita. Most recently, it's around 2. So we had a factor of 7, a per capita reduction in loads of nearly 7-fold. So even with the increase in population. And actually this, well, let me go this one first. This is another way of looking at it. This is on the bars look at the increase in the population of Tampa Bay's watershed from the 1940s to 2010, and the three major counties. So it's been going up pretty rapidly, right? Well, this little green line is kind of hard to see, but here's really high chlorophylls, and as the population continued to increase, dealing with those loads of nitrogen, we've been able to see a significant improvement in water quality in Tampa Bay as measured by chlorophyll. Remember, chlorophyll is an important thing affecting light attenuation, affecting seagrasses. So this is, you know, as simple-minded as this is, it's been really effective in dealing with a variety of different audiences, including very important regulators and decision makers in terms of county commissions, city councils, et cetera. Red and green. Red's bad, green's good, right? We had set chlorophyll targets for each of the 4 segments, Old Tampa Bay, Hillsborough Bay, Middle and Lower Tampa Bay. So with each year of data collection, we can compare what that year's chlorophyll level looked like compared to the target that we had established. Now again, in the bad old days, you know, things were pretty crappy, except for Lower Tampa Bay, which even it had its own problems in years. Tampa Bay was in pretty bad shape. But remember, we passed the wastewater legislation. Took a little while, but things started getting better. Passed some legislation and regulation on stormwater. Things started getting a little bit better. The Estuary program was formed in 1991, and of course, they take credit for all the green to happen since then, right? No, so, I mean, it's really apparent that things have changed very significantly relative to that threshold that we had established. And importantly, you know, we saw some bumps. These are El Nino years primarily. Old Tampa Bay it's kind of been the black sheep of the family in many respects, but you know, in the last 3 years, all 4 major bay segments of Tampa Bay have met their chlorophyll targets. And you know, that's when we break out the champagne. Because it's important, and this is why it's important. The Southwest Florida Water Management District biannually goes out and they do photography, aerial photography of seagrasses throughout the district, including Tampa Bay. And we've been using their data for years. And what they showed was in the last survey, we actually have more seagrass now than we did in 1950, which is incredible. And when you think about what's happened, that is absolutely incredible. We had a little bit of a bump, and unfortunately we may see that this coming year because the El Nino that they're predicting may be one of the top 3 worst El Ninos on record. But in 1998 we had a little bit of a bump in the road. But the interesting thing was if you look at the rate of increase here and the rate of increase here, we're actually gaining more seagrass faster now than we did before that El Nino. And there's probably some positive feedback. As you get more seagrass, the response may be even faster, and that's what we think was happening. So, what do we do? Well, this is the Tampa Bay Business Journal. They came out with an article after those numbers came out, and they came up with these numbers. They said that 1 of every 5 jobs in the Estuary program watershed is dependent upon a healthy bay. It's worth $22 billion a year to the local economies. And it represents 13% of the economy of the 6 counties that surround Tampa Bay. So the business leaders are saying that's important. And we're seeing some of those, they're actually, you know, the quality of life is really important. And we're seeing, as expected, some increases in population. I mean, there's a lot of building going on and those sorts of things, trying to bring new industry in. But what we're faced with is dealing with those issues. We can't just kind of say we did our job and go home. You know, things are great. We're having a really wet year this year, and who knows what may happen with seagrasses. But, you know, we can certainly expect the things to get better. But this is kind of scary. There's an estimate that the population of Tampa Bay is going to double by 1950, or 2050. That's a lot. And remember we talked about before some of the problems that happen with increase in population, more wastewater, stormwater issues, et cetera. But there's a lot of things that have been put, a lot of tools that have been put in place to address those things as we have in the past. One of the important ones is, and when we talk about caps on loads, well, we had to be careful. There's legislation really didn't allow us to use the trading word. So we talk about transfers. And basically what transfers are is coming up with an efficient, cost-effective way to meet those load reduction targets by allowing the partners of the consortium to work together. And one of the interesting things is that we're not only talking about, maybe one county government with a city government or whatever it may be, but we started knocking down silos within governments. The stormwater guys, they have their own silo, and the utility directors and the wastewater guys are in a different silo. Well, one of the things that's happened while we've been working on this consortium is we've knocked those silos down, and they're working together, for maybe in many cases the first time, to find ways in which they can, as a unit, come up with their loading targets. So this is one of the tools that we're hopefully going to be using as that population increases over the years. But there are other issues, and I know this is probably for some a difficult one to accept, but the reality is this is the sea level in St. Petersburg, and it's gone up, as they say, 1 inch per decade since the 1950s. And the expectations that we don't know whether that slope is going to change or not, but we know it's probably going to continue to increase. Now this is a picture of the western portion of Tampa Bay. This is basically the city of St. Petersburg. And it's looking at the current condition, what's going to happen with a 1 meter sea level rise and a 2 meters sea level rise. Well, that's pretty important to me because I live in that little island right there. And by the time we get over here, we're going to be swimming, right? So, and again, this is another issue that the Estuary program is going to be dealing with as we progress in time. It's a very vibrant program, and I deal a lot not only with the local NEPs but also nationally. And Tampa Bay has always been put up as the poster child for estuary programs around the country. My friends in Chesapeake Bay, they're very, very, very jealous of the fact because Chesapeake Bay was the thing, but we've by far outpassed them in terms of responses. So, so the estuary program is going to be dealing with things like blue carbon and ocean acidification. There's some talk about that already today. Very important, again, is that community involvement. Volunteer workshops, Bay mini grants to help fuel that initiative or those initiatives that are going on in the watershed. The fertilizer ordinance that, it really began like in Sarasota County with my friend Jack Merriam, but Tampa Bay picked up the ball and as far as fertilizer ordinance and have worked very, very, very diligently in trying to address this issue. For example, in Pinellas County, you can't buy fertilizer today. We're not going to be able to buy fertilizer until after. Thank you. It's there are lots of questions of how important it is, but anything that you can, we've gotten the low-hanging fruit, the point sources, the easy stormwater. There are going to be little smaller things that are going to be really important to address and meeting that future load that we can expect with the population. And there are other things. The consortium, again, is going to, continue its work. I heard yesterday that Tampa Bay Estuary Program got $2 million of Restore Act money. So that's going to be money that's going to be, I'm sure, going to be well spent. And so those are things that are going on right now. What's the take-home message? Well, there's a couple things. Why did it work in Tampa Bay? And why can't it work in other areas? Well, in my own opinion, there's no reason why I can't work in other areas. But it's a matter of having that commitment, the cooperation, the collaborativeness. But these are some of the things that I think were really important. One of them was to have that indicator. That was important to the people as well as to the scientists. You know, it's not just all science, but it's also, you know, the quality of life. And seagrass was that very important thing that we used up front. And the other important thing, going back to that third bullet, is having numeric goals. So you knew what you were shooting for, and it wasn't this indeterminate improve, increase seagrass. You know, there was an area that we wanted to get to. And that's really important because then it's easier for decision makers to make those decisions about how money is being spent if there is a goal to be met. And I think that, again, that was really important. That whole idea about community, about willingness to work together was absolutely critical. And in many cases, some very disparate stakeholders, you know, working together. When we put together the allocation of the loads, we actually came up with allocations for 80 different NPDES permits. And everybody agreed to them. And it was because we did, you know, we took baby steps. We met once a month, and we, you know, went forward in a very logical fashion. And it becomes a much easier job to convince people that that's the right thing to do if you do it in small pieces. So that was a really important thing. The other important thing is a commitment largely by Hillsborough County, but also there's long-term monitoring that's going on, especially with respect to seagrasses by Swiftmud and water quality by the other counties. But that commitment to long-term monitoring, because you want to show that it makes a difference, that what you've done has made a difference. And so that commitment to long-term monitoring is a really important one. Assessment and adjustment. One of the things that we did do, and it was not the way folks necessarily like to do things, we would decide on a question to be answered. And we would decide up front what the rules of the game were. If we got this response, you know, this is what we would do. If we got this response, we would do something different. Then you run the data through and you see what your response is. So there's no, well, we get the data and then decide what we want to do. You go through the logic of coming up with an appropriate response to whatever change you may see, and that assessment and adjustment is something that's really, really important. And lastly, it never hurts to bring the economic value into play because it is important. These are difficult times in many cases for the stakeholders to deal with voters in the case of the public sector and stockholders in the case of the private sector. So that's what I have to say today, and thank you for inviting me again.
Hey, Tony, great presentation. I have a question about the recent sewage dumps in the Tampa Bay area. And my question is, I'm wondering if they play any part of the transfer system, or if they will. I know they're emergency sewage dumps, so they're unplanned. So that's one question. Do they get into the formula that is within that transfer system? And the other question is, what impact do you think they have with regard to all of the cleanup and all of the restoration that is done, and then what do these dumps do?
Okay, first thing I don't like the word sewage. It's not that, you know, when you think of sewage, you're thinking about nasty stuff. Some of the stuff that's ending up having to be released into Tampa Bay right now, by the city of St. Pete and city of Tampa and others, I'm sure, has gone through some treatment. So I just want to, you know, get that on the record. The issue is, this is a rare event. I mean, you know, how often do you see 8 inches of rain in 6 hours kind of thing? So no matter what you may do in you know, when engineers develop stormwater systems, they put safety factors in them, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is, these are old systems. You know, those engineers did that stuff back in the 50s, some in the 60s. So with their expectations as to what the worst cases may be probably didn't even come close to what we saw in the last couple of weeks. So there's that issue. I mean, the reality of it is, it does have to go someplace. But there's probably going to be, Peter's going to have to pay for that to Paul at some point as we move forward. They're going to have to take those things into consideration. The important thing is, what's the response in Tampa Bay? And if there's a bright side to this problem, is that with all of the rain and runoff that's occurring, the Tampa Bay is flushing very much faster than it did last month. And so whatever may be getting in there isn't going to have a long enough residence time maybe to see too significant of a change in water quality. There was a more blameful act that was done by one city maybe about 10 years ago. I was asked to come and take a look at it. There was a smaller wastewater plant that one of their operators left the valve open for a whole weekend. And so instead of going through the plant, the stuff was going around the plant into Tampa Bay. Those things, that's a blameful act. You've got to do something about that. Luckily, it wasn't so much that it has any significant effect on Tampa Bay. We still don't know what's happened yet. When I was driving up yesterday, it was raining like the dickens in Tampa. We expect another really wet weekend, so we'll have to wait and see what happens. It's one of the problems you have with especially with aging infrastructure.
So just a follow-up, understanding that they're old systems, would it be the recommendation of, let's say, the Estuary program or Janicki consultants to invest in, a rehabilitation of those systems, considering the sustainability issue, climate change, et cetera? Or are you comfortable with this rare event issue just remaining?
Well, I think there's 2 points to that question. Number one is, actually, the city of Tampa had put forward a plan to improve their stormwater treatment system. And it was many, many, many millions of dollars. And they ran that up the flagpole. There were some public workshops, and of course, people don't want to pay for it. But now I think maybe they're going to think twice about it after this recent turn of events. Because not only, you got to think about not only the Tampa Bay, but the human population that's being affected with flooding. It's, car accidents. 3 sisters from St. Pete ended up being in a car accident. They were killed because of another plane hydroplaning. So there's a lot of other issues besides water quality in Tampa Bay that they need to address. I don't see any reticence on the part of any of the government's agencies that run these systems to doing better. It's just a matter of, is there the political will? Are the people going to be willing to pay for those things? I mean, there are plans on improving. There are lots of plans for improving things like stormwater and wastewater treatment that are on the table, but they just haven't gotten the money yet.
Anybody else?
Roy?
Roy, hold on. Let me get you the microphone.
That was a great presentation. I just have one question that came up, and that was on the residential.
Mm-hmm.
Could you be more descriptive of what that included?
The common methodology for looking at land use in the state of Florida is this Florida Land Use Cover System. And it designates particular land use types and covers to, aerial photographs. And so we have these photo interpreters that go in and they look at these photographs and they say that's a 1600 flux code or a 1200 or whatever. The residential there is a combination of, in that system, low density, high density, and medium density residential areas. Different from, as you saw, there was a commercial industrial sector as well. That was not included in that residential. So it's truly residential, but it could go from anything from a home on a 5-acre lot to a high-density condo. You know, it's a combination of those.